I get this a lot when people look at me and I look healthy and I look like I'm successful and very put together. Um, and people have hard time sometimes believing the trauma that I suffered for so many years. Well, trauma, the way it works, it's not like it can just disappear. And even with therapy and healing, it's not one day event. It's a lifelong journey that you have to take. And the best way I can describe it, it's like learning how to live your life again, or for example, swim, right? Without your arm. Now your arm is missing. And you have two choices. You can focus on the fact that your arm is missing, and I have a choice to be focused on what is lost and be in a miserable place and be angry. But I choose to focus on the fact that I have the rest of my body and it's only one arm that is missing, and I can still move on and I can learn how to swim again and how to live my life again.
The history of domestic violence goes back to things such as the rule of thumb, where women were considered chattel and a man could do whatever they wanted to their chattel, including beating them as long as they used a switch or a stick, which was not wider than the width of their thumb. That's sort of the historic part of domestic violence. More modernly, domestic violence in the United States was treated as dispute resolution between a couple until fairly recently. It wasn't until the 60s and early 70s that people started to view domestic violence as a crime. Prior to that, police academies and prosecutors would look at domestic violence and they would say, well, this is a family issue. This is something that needs to be resolved within the home and not an issue for the government to involve itself in.
I think a lot of people think of domestic violence as being somebody being hit or slapped or kicked or guns used against them, and that would be physical domestic violence. And it can even be the threat of some of those things. But there are also a lot of other types of domestic violence that are often a little more insidious, like people don't think of them as counting as domestic violence, which can keep victims in relationships longer than is perhaps safe for them. For instance, emotional abuse, where somebody's constantly being put down or threatened or taught to feel less than. There can be sexual violence within a relationship, which also is domestic violence. There's financial abuse, which many of our clients experience, but don't really include when they're talking about their experience. So that can look like being forced to work, but not having access to your own money. That can look like being put on an allowance, being told you have $20 a week and you need to feed our entire family with that $20. So all of those things are different types of domestic violence, and most people experience more than one of those types. So it creates many barriers to moving on, leaving that relationship, ever being safe and comfortable in your own home.
You know, you have to understand that life was all that I knew, and it only takes one time of feeling lonely or feeling just sad, and I reached out. And he made me feel good. And he promised that he would never hurt me again. He promised that we would get the happily ever after.
For a lot of people, it's easy to be very judgmental of someone in a domestic violence situation. why did she keep going back? You know, if I'd been in that situation and he laid one hand on me, I would have left. And if it was that easy, the person would have done it. But it's not that easy. There's a natural bonding process that occurs when you're with somebody, when you're in a relationship with them, when you are engaged in sexual relations, when you're married, when you have kids, etc. All these different types of situations, or if you're just dating, you form a bond with that person. And it's actually a physiological bond with that person that makes it very hard to leave them. And so that's what a trauma bond is, and that's why it takes somebody a long time, several times usually, to leave that person fully. And even when they leave that person, they still have feelings towards them. I have done many forensic medical exams where I'm in the room with someone who has been strangled and beaten multiple times, and they express an internal conflict of, I know I need to leave him, but I still love him, despite all of the things he's done to me. And I explained to them, that's not your fault, that's a trauma bond. It would happen to anybody in that situation. It would happen to me. We are all bound by those same kind of basic physiological principles, and bonding is one of those principles. And in this case in specific, it's trauma bonding. Oftentimes too, they're just emotionally burnt out. And so even when they're away from their abuser and they're with their family, they're with their kids, they're with somebody else, they don't get that same feeling that they do when they're around the person they're bonded to. Eventually that feeling will come back, but in the beginning stages, it's not there. And so that's the reason why many times they go back to their abuser.
Upon my return, he put me in the room. For 3 days, he forced me to smoke crack cocaine. He would rape me. He would humiliate me. He interrogated me. He wanted to know every single person that I have spoken to that entire 8 months. He wanted to know where I've been the whole entire time. Where have you been? Who have you spoken to? Who did you tell? Now prove it. Prove to me you weren't out there having sex. Prove it. For 3 days, there's no food, he's keeping me awake the whole entire time. So after this 3rd day, my brain is like half gone. I can't even think straight. And I remember I was on the floor, in the corner, just like in a little ball. And he walked over to me, and he's standing over me, and he looks down and he says, "You ever gonna leave me again?" I said, "No, Greg, I promise. I'll never leave you again, I promise." And he goes, So then he walked over to the Bible, or he walked over to the closet, reached up to bring down the Bible. There's only one reason that Bible followed us wherever we went. He placed the Bible in front of my face. He said, "Make the promise." And I knew what he was talking about because we've been through this before. And so I placed my hand on the Bible and I said, "I swear to God, I will never leave you again." At that point, he got this most evil look in his eye, something I had never seen before. He said, "No. Place your hand on the Bible and swear to God that if you ever do leave me again, may God strike our son down in a painful and horrible death." And so I placed my hand on the Bible and I said the words that would make the pain and torture stop for the night, but would keep me trapped for the rest of my life.
There was one point where we were at a stoplight and my trafficker was driving, and my weight trainer from high school pulled up next to us. And a lot of people might think, oh, that's when you would want to reach out for help and kind of wave and get his attention. But instead I slunk back in the chair to hide from him because I didn't want him to see me. I was so ashamed of being this athlete and now looking the way I did, so scrawny and skinny. And not long after, I had a phone call with one of my big sisters. And the conversation kind of led to getting away from him. And she said, "You know, Jenna, you can always come home." And until she said that to me, it never occurred to me that that was an option. And so I started to kind of plan an escape.
The cycle of violence doesn't happen in every violent relationship, but in about 2/3 or a little bit more, it does. And sometimes victims don't see the cycle because we come become habituated to the abuse. So little gradual increases in abuse we become used to, and pretty soon we're just living in this reality of abuse and tension, and we don't understand what it is we're living through. One of the first things I ask victims is, can you see it coming? Because if you can see it coming, it describes the tension building phase of the cycle of abuse. And if you can see it coming, you can predict it. And if you can predict it, you can manage it, develop coping skills. And the better we become at managing the abuse, the less traumatic that abuse can be. The worse we are at managing the abuse, the more traumatic the abuse will be. So the tension building phase is a very important educational component that I talk with victims about. The acute episode, we all know what that is. It doesn't always have to be physical. It can be a barrage of verbal insults, demeaning, dehumanizing, degrading comments filled with profanity and personal criticisms, followed by traditionally the honeymoon phase.
Classically, what this looks like is a lot of apology. It might be gifts. It might be, I'm so sorry, that's never going to happen again. It might be, let's go out and celebrate because I was just really, that was a mistake on my part. But then imbued in this is often a, you didn't do a good enough job to keep me under control. You could have done better, and I hope you've learned your lesson. Imbued within this terrible equation that's developed. And then the cycle starts again. And the build-up begins. And the eggshells return, and the cycle happens, and it might become quicker and quicker. But this dread, this intense dread of what is going to come, even in the good times, this intense dread of what is to come is there. And it lives and it breathes with the individual who's surviving this. And so the intimidation component can happen. And what I'll say is that, as we call this false honeymoon phase, sometimes that just goes away. And it's just a cycle of anticipation and injury, anticipation and injury, over and over, and never knowing when it's going to happen, when it's going to end. And so individuals find themselves planning, dreading what this event is going to happen, when it's going to happen, and what can I do to possibly stop it. This idea, almost a fantasy, they'll change, right? This is the last cycle. This was a wonderful, I got to go out, they bought me this wonderful thing. It's going to change now, it's going to stop. And then it doesn't.
I remember one day he came home and he said, "Oh, I quit my job. You know what? You can be the breadwinner of our house. I don't need to work. I'll just be home. And you're really good at working hard anyways." And then he was trying to control where I'm going, what I'm doing. He really isolated me from my family, from anyone else, and he always told me that what happens in our family should stay within the family. Now his drug habits were becoming too expensive, and within a short amount of time we depleted all of our savings. So one night I decided to put up a fight and told him that I will not give him money because we're really big financial trouble. And I remember that he looked at me and he grabbed me by my hair and dragged me all the way from the second floor of our house to the kitchen. I was screaming, it was extremely painful, and then he started kicking me and slapping my face. And he just left me. Going back, I just realized that at that moment I was in so much pain. I remember I had so many bruises all over my body. I was shocked, but I never even thought that I'm a victim here or I should tell someone. It never even occurred in my head because I always knew whatever my husband is doing should be staying within family. And of course, there is no option of divorce. So that was the first incident when the physical abuse started.
The power and control wheel is a model which is used to represent violent behavior within a domestic violence relationship. So one of the ways to look at that is to look at it as almost a wheel or a pie chart, if you will, of ways in which an abuser can exercise their power and control over the victim. So the power and control wheel has 8 segments to it. You don't need all 8 segments to be in an abusive relationship, and you can be in a non-abusive relationship and still have some aspects of the power and control wheel. So when we look at the power and control wheel, we can start with male privilege. Male privilege means that the abuser exercises their power and control over the victim because they're the head of the household or the king of the castle. You have utilizing the children as a form of abuse, where by saying that they will take the children away or obtain custody of the children, or that they will inflict harm on the children, they can then control their victims. You also have isolation, where the abuser will seek to isolate the victim from friends or family. So those are 3. In addition to that, you also have emotional abuse, where you can call someone names. You have intimidation and coercion, which is another way of doing harm to the victims. You also have minimizing, denying, and blaming. So yes, I did this, but it's not my fault. It's your fault because you weren't nice to me, or because you didn't do what I said. You brought this upon yourself. So those are just some of the ways in which you can have power and control. Now, like I said, in a power and control wheel, some of those aspects don't necessarily indicate domestic violence. So a family might have a checkbook and one party controls that checkbook. That doesn't mean that it's an abusive relationship. What makes it abusive is that one party is utilizing that form of power and control to exercise either physical or sexual violence over the victim. And that's how we get an abusive relationship. So while some of these aspects may be present, having some of them present doesn't mean it's necessarily abusive. They're just indicators.
I didn't recognize the domestic violence. I knew there was uncomfortable situations, but not ever being educated on it. I wasn't being physically beaten. There was one occurrence where that happened. So in my mind, I didn't think that I was surviving domestic violence. I just knew I didn't like the way I felt, and I knew that I wasn't happy. But he would do things like block me in doorways and take my paychecks from work, and take my car keys, take my cell phone, separate me from my support system. There was one time I was at work and my boss was like, "Do you know that person out front?" And it was at nighttime, and there was somebody parked out front of the store and shining their lights in the store. And I kind of looked down and said, "That's my husband," and was really embarrassed. And that was something he would do to watch me, to check on me, to make sure I wasn't telling anybody.
We also know that intimate partner violence has far-reaching consequences. It can result in physical injury, and it can lead to chronic disease and mental health problems throughout life. It also increases risk for smoking, binge drinking, and other health risk behaviors.
I can't even describe the state of my emotional health at all this time, because I was overworking myself. I was only sleeping 3-4 hours, and I never processed what happened to me in childhood or in my marriage.
I think in that life also you're so secluded. You have to understand that when you're in a domestic violence situation, chances are you don't have friends, you don't have family. You have been taken away. You're in this little bubble all by yourself. And so even trying to make friends, trying to make connections, trying to live in the real world after living in this other situation, it's almost like night and day. It's ice cold water compared to hot water.
Now, yes, I knew that I was a victim, and I was helping my body physically and mentally to go through this trauma. But now I had to enter the dating world, right? And start relationships. And I was absolutely not equipped for that aspect. I ended up, even after my divorce, I ended up in 2 more emotionally abusive relationships, and where my partners were extremely controlling. They were controlling who I talk to and the way I dress and what I do daily. And it was such an upsetting moment when I again realizing that yet you fell again for this cycle of abuse.
If someone's in a domestic violence relationship, the odds of them receiving trauma to their head or being strangled are pretty high. Some of the short-term aspects would be the injuries that they present with to the ER, broken bones, bruises, traumatic brain injuries, as I mentioned. And if they continue in that relationship and they continue receiving blows to the head or strangulation, they can develop traumatic brain injury over and over and over again. And we know that the effects from traumatic brain injury are what we call dose response, meaning the more you have, and especially the closer they are, the longer the outcome in terms it takes to heal. The longer it takes to heal, the worse the prognosis, the more likely you are to have chronic problems, especially chronic memory problems from those injuries. And so the dangers of that are that if you keep receiving these types of injuries, you may take longer to heal, or you may end up having chronic problems, maybe even disability from this type of relationship. There's also a psychological impact from domestic violence that's separate from the physical. Anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance use, these are all risk factors associated with domestic violence. The injury that occurs to your brain when you're hit hard enough to cause a TBI or you're strangled has a separate impact on anxiety, depression, and suicidality. That's separate from the psychological trauma. What that means is if you're experiencing both traumatic brain injuries and you're in a domestic violence relationship with psychological trauma, the two are compounded. So your risk of depression, anxiety, suicidality goes up even more. Those are some of the impacts that domestic violence has on the victim, on the patient who's experiencing domestic violence.
Importantly, the burden of intimate partner violence is not only felt by survivors and their loved ones. There are also significant economic consequences for society as a whole. Costs related to healthcare, criminal justice, and lost productivity due to intimate partner violence have been estimated at over $100,000 per female victim and over $20,000 per male victim of intimate partner violence over the course of their lifetime. At the population level, that results in a total economic burden of $3.6 trillion. And about 37% of those costs are paid by taxpayers through increased costs related to healthcare and criminal justice.
When I went to the urgent care, I had so many signs of somebody that had been through a lot of trauma. I was way underweight. My hair was falling out in clumps. I had a branding, various stages of bruising, and I was acting very erratic. And everyone was talking around me, but nobody was talking to me. And it felt like they were assuming my story. And so that rebellion kind of stirred up in me again, where I thought, well, if nobody cares, I guess I won't tell anybody. And it was at that point I thought I would go the rest of my life without anybody knowing what really happened to me.
I knew early on that I was a victim of domestic violence. I want to say probably when I about turned 20, 21. That's when I started seeing the ads, domestic violence, call the domestic violence hotline. There's one thing that I've always said is like, what that showed me, I didn't know what, and do what? What, I'm supposed to call this number for what? They never said there's help. They never said this is what help looks like. They never said this is what will happen if you ask for help. They said domestic violence hotline, call us. For what? To say hello? And so so I started learning about domestic violence, and even in the healthcare setting, I remember, they would ask those questions, it's like, name, insurance, does your husband beat you? Do you feel safe at home? And I was like, they weren't really asking me. It was just like a technical, I never felt like they cared. And so I'd always just say no, I'm fine. And But I remember there were times that I did run. I tried to escape to domestic violence shelters. I just remember feeling so uncomfortable. I did not feel safe. I don't know these people. I was scared. And I just felt so uncomfortable being in this home. Until finally, it was like, I wish somebody could experience what it is like for a victim of abuse to end up in one of these shelters, because it's indescribable.
What we find is that there's a much bigger issue in our community with people feeling like they can't report or not knowing where that they can turn. And that's where the bigger issue is that people don't know they can get help for what they're going through. So the Family Justice Center is able to assist victims by being a safe place for individuals to come and learn about options. When someone walks through our door, we have the opportunity to teach them about not only what they're going through is not okay, but in some regards, some of the impact of what they're experiencing is criminal in nature. And through our ability to build rapport and make people feel safe and make people feel that they have decisions they can make, it allows for us to have the opportunity to offer an individual to report a crime, and that is what we do. So many people who come into our center can go from 0 to reporting a crime, and sometimes an abuser is arrested that particular day and ends up in jail.
I think probably the most important thing that can be done is for people to talk about it. Domestic violence is one of the most historically underreported crimes. That's because people see it happening in the home and they don't want to get involved. They hear neighbors shouting next door, and they might hear things slamming or things like that, and they don't want to get involved. But domestic violence impacts not only the direct victim, but it can also impact secondary victims. We know that children are deeply affected by domestic violence, and it affects them so much that it counts as one of the points that a child can accumulate in the Adverse Childhood Experiences score. And that score doesn't indicate that a child will be or won't be an abuser or a victim, but it does increase their risk for other health and social diseases and injuries that could occur to them. So being aware of that and talking about it, and not being afraid to ask people if they need help and to keep the door open for them, I think is the most important thing that we can do as a nation.